One of my favorite confections, especially around the Christmas holidays, is what I call Magic Cherries. These are a chocolate, cherry, and alcohol mixture. That's all that's in it. And I found that my coworkers and friends and associates in various musical groups really love these things, and it's become a tradition around the holidays for me to make several batches of them. And I don't think there's any great secret to this, but I thought I would share the making of these for anybody else who might find them interesting and might want to make the same thing. And also I'm going to cover a few of the techniques that I've found advantageous to making the Magic Cherries. Now, I apologize for the video compromises made here. I have to shoot this in my small kitchen with the refrigerator running next to it and inadequate lighting. I've actually got a couple shop lamps from my wood shop set up here, but it's not ideal. Anyway, I hope that I can show enough of this adequately. So the ingredients in making Magic Cherries are maraschino cherries. Doesn't really matter which brand, just regular maraschino cherries. I usually get a jar. This is a 1 pound jar. It's 16 ounces. That's a good size. I also have a cherry cordial mold. These are the kind that you see with cherries or small nuts or mints embedded in chocolate in a kind of a dome-shaped chocolate shape. The mold makes a flat bottom. Of course, this is upside down. If you turn the cordials upside down, they'd have kind of a curly Q shape at the top. And the mold is designed to make those, and it's the proper size for making cherry cordials, so there's enough room in here for the average maraschino cherry. This particular one here is, it actually has Cyrillic writing on it, but it says made in Italy on it. There are quite a number of these things. I think this is some sort of a polycarbonate. This one holds 28, or has 28 molds in it, but pretty much anything of the same sort would work, regardless of the brand. This is just the one I happen to have. So what you need to do, besides getting a jar of maraschino cherries, is you need some melting chocolate. I like the Wilton candy dips. This is the one they call light cocoa, but they also have one that's a dark chocolate. And these are in small tubs, and they're full of little wafers of chocolate, sort of like a flattened Hershey Kiss. And these are formulated ideally for melting. You can use these to dip into to get a chocolate coating, or you can use them for molding things like chocolate cordials, or cherry cordials rather. I usually just buy these directly from Wilton's. There's a buy it option on their website, and it's actually Wilton, not Wilton's. I keep saying Wilton, sorry about that. But it's Wilton. I think it's just wilton.com. They don't sell them directly, but they've got an affiliation with another company that takes care of their web orders. The trick with these is they don't work quite as well when they're old, and sometimes stores will have stock that's older than it should be, and you don't get quite the same consistency when you melt it. So I tend to buy them directly from Wilton through their affiliation with the distributor, in the hopes that I get the freshest product. Having said that, if you get the older product, Wilton recommends that if you find it's not turning into quite the right viscosity when melted, you can pre-melt a little vegetable shortening and mix a little bit of it in with the molten chocolate to lighten up the consistency a little bit. I've never done that, but that is apparently an option. So I have several of these tubs here. I've got my cherries. The other thing you'll need is a colander or a strainer of some sort. Put it in my sink, and I just dump all the cherry juice off into the colander and make sure that I kind of shake it around and get as much of the cherry juice out as possible, and then put the cherries back into the jar and fill it up with one of these two things. I prefer Bacardi 151. It's a high alcohol content rum, but my understanding is this has been discontinued by Bacardi. Some other companies may make it. I don't know. I've been using up my stock of Bacardi 151. Another alternative that I have used successfully is Everclear. It's inexpensive, it's readily available, and it's got the same alcohol content as Bacardi 151. The difference here is that they both give you the same nice warm alcohol buzz when you eat the cherry cordial, in this case the Magic Cherry, but it has a somewhat stronger kick to it, and sometimes people who aren't quite suspecting what they're getting into when they eat one of these can be even a little alarmed at first because it has that initial hard alcohol bite to it, whereas I find that the Bacardi 151 has a warmer feeling to it, and people just generally prefer it. So that's what I like to use whenever possible. The way you do this then is you just pour the rum into the jar of the cherries after you put the cherries back in until it's filled up. I usually shake it pretty good to distribute it, and then I put it in the fridge for about a week to marinate them. I've done it with as little as 1 day of marination. It works pretty well. Seems to work a little better if I give it a few days. I usually just do it a week in advance of when I'm going to make the cordials. I usually have a plate set aside to put my utensils on while I'm working, because you always get things that are covered with chocolate. I usually have a small, like a teaspoon. I have a wooden chopstick, although lots of things would work for this, but you do need to stir the chocolate, and I found that with the chopstick, less chocolate sticks to it than it would if I try to use a spoon or something larger, so it's a little easier to clean up. And so I've got my chopstick, and I also have a ceramic cauldron of sorts. I'm not sure what it's called technically, but it's a ceramic vessel into which you put the chocolate to melt it, and I think being ceramic, it maybe helps hold the heat a little better, but you can actually melt them just directly in the plastic tubs that they come from Wilton. I've done that successfully. If you follow the directions, it works just fine. So I have my cherries here. I've decided that I'm going to drain them out at this point, but there is one more thing that I forgot. It's kind of out of the picture here, but it's a dinner plate with 2 layers of paper towel sitting on it, and this is to put the cherries on for draining before they're put into the chocolate molds. So I start off by dumping everything into the colander. Shake it around a little bit, just try to... These cherries have all been pitted, of course, so they've got a hole in the middle, and some of the alcohol goes into the hole and makes a little more liquid than you'd like. So I usually just bounce it and roll it around a little bit in the sink to encourage as much of that to leave the cherries as possible. And then I pour them out on the paper towel. And I put another plate over the first plate to discourage evaporation while I'm preparing everything else. So I put that aside. The next thing to do is to preheat the mold. This isn't a strictly necessary step, but I found it's useful. I invert the mold, I put it on the sink, and I fill it up with hot water, and I let it sit there warming up the mold while I microwave the chocolate. So I get my tub of Wilton chocolate, I fill up the melting cauldron here. It looks like I'm going to need a little bit more than 1 tub. I actually had some left in there. It wasn't completely full from a previous batch. Now with the chocolate candy dips in the melting tub, regardless of whether they're melted in the plastic when they come in or in the ceramic one or whatever other vessel you may choose to use, they go into the microwave. I start out with 60 seconds and I change the power level to 50. There we go. Power level 50 for 60 seconds. And this is just the initial melting step. There are 2 or 3 steps you're going to have to go through before it's completely melted. The first one is 60 seconds, and then you take it out, stir it a little bit, microwave it for a little bit longer, and keep working it until it's totally molten. While the chocolate was melting, I put out a sheet of wax paper on my work surface that comes in handy later on. Alright, so this is the first pass of the chocolate. It's just starting to warm up. And it doesn't really get completely melted yet, but it's starting to get molten, especially on the bottom. And the trick here is to just jostle it around in there. It ends up packing the chocolate wafers a little bit more tightly, since the bottom ones are a little softer at this point. Okay, this is after the second microwaving pass. The bottom is completely molten at this point, but the ones on the top still need to be stirred down in there somewhat. And at this point, I usually add a few more and kind of top it off. And then back into the microwave. %50 power level for 30 seconds. This is the third pass. And while that chocolate's going through its third pass, I want to talk about the chocolate syringe that I designed and built in my companion video to this video. If you want to check that out, it's a inexpensive PVC syringe for helping to put the chocolate into the molds. And I've got a kind of chintzy poor man's cardboard stand to put it in so it stands up straight. I'll be bringing that out in a second. Okay, at the end of the third pass, most of the chocolate's pretty well melted in there, and I'm stirring in the new ones I added. That's mostly just to bring the level up. It's hard to stir and hold the camera with one hand, but you can see the general consistency here, and there's still the ones I put in at the end that need a bit of mixing. And back in the microwave. 30 more seconds at a 50% power level. While I'm nuking for the 4th time, it's time to carefully pull the water out. I don't want to get any water in the molds. So the pre-warmed mold is here now. And at this point, the chocolate is pretty thoroughly melted. Okay, here's the part I've not actually done before, so this is going to be an experiment in the middle of the demonstration. I have a piece of wax paper in the bottom of this box just to help keep things clean. And I'm going to use my teaspoon to help coerce the chocolate into the mold. I should have said into the syringe. Okay, I have this syringe full of chocolate now. And I have my plunger assembly. And my mold. So I'm going to start out by putting the plunger into the syringe and injecting and I'm just putting a little pressure on the syringe at each stage, or on the plunger of the syringe. So I've got chocolate in each one of the molds now, and to make sure it goes completely into the swirl pattern at the what's now the bottom but will be the top of each mold, I just take my chopstick and swirl it around in each one very briefly. When I'm done with that, I also, just for good measure, make sure I've got rid of all the air bubbles by tapping it like that. And then come the cherries. One cherry gets pushed lightly into each of the molds. It displaces a lot of the chocolate that's in there, but I didn't put so much in there that it comes up to the top of the mold even after the cherry is inserted. Although on some of them it comes closer than others. The abnormally large cherries in the bunch. The chocolate remains molten enough to put these cherries in. It hasn't gotten hard. Alright, now all the cherries are in. I put my plate back over the remaining handful of cherries because I'm going to make another tiny batch when I'm done with this just to use them up. And I don't have enough chocolate in my syringe at this point to fill them up, so I'm going to have to melt a little bit more chocolate. So I put this aside for the moment, and I take my cauldron out here. And my screwdriver. Those people who've watched the video on making this syringe know that I've got this screw in here to keep the cap from popping off. So now I just work off the cap, hopefully not making a big mess. And I use the plunger to push out the remaining chocolate. There's not that much in there. It takes me about a cup of chocolate to make the molds as far as I've got them, and the cauldron holds about a cup and a third, so I poured some back into here, and I've got some that's still inside the cap here, which I'm going to spoon out. Back into the cauldron. Now I don't want this chocolate to become a mold, a frozen mass inside of here, so I'm immediately going to put it inside warm running water to help break it up, because I am going to flush it out. And now I just put some more of the wafers, chocolate wafers, into the cauldron. Just for good measure, I'm going to put a few more in there than that. I may have some left over. And it's time to repeat the nuking sequence. I won't show that in detail again, but it's exactly the same as the first time. While the nuking is taking place, it's time to clean up the syringe in preparation. In my video on making this syringe, I pointed out that I had a small bottle brush to clean the nozzle out, or the needle. I don't really know what putting some water into this would do, so I push the wad of paper towel through the syringe just to dry it out. Clean off the plunger. As well as the cap. Now it's ready for another use. It only takes, I don't know, 30 to 40 seconds to clean this up adequately for the next batch. And I put the cap back on, put my screw in there. So this is the second batch, now that it's nice and molten. And it's time to refill the syringe. This time I'm going to use the opposite side of the plunger I made. The first time I used the O-ring side, and this time I'm going to use the side with the masking tape, which is the poor man's O-ring, and much easier for people to make at home. See how that one works. Put the plunger in to the syringe. It's important to not overfill these. And I'm also finding it useful to twist the plunger slightly. It keeps it from binding. I think there's always a tendency for a little bit of chocolate to get between the O-ring and the inside wall of the syringe and solidify and make it bind up a little bit. And twisting it seems to keep that from happening, or at least it breaks it loose before you notice there's a problem. Okay, so now there's the final step here, and that's just to kind of swirl, or not so much swirl, just sort of dab the chocolate Some of these are slightly overfilled. Got a little carried away. Doesn't really hurt anything. I'm doing this just to entice the chocolate to fill every nook and cranny of the mold. Okay, so the chocolate's swirled in there, and now the final thing is to make sure it's good and settled. Doing this, sometimes you get some air bubbles that come to the top. I'm looking for those, and I pop them. That seems to be about it. Settle it one more time. and now it's ready to go in the freezer. I usually put these in the freezer for about half an hour to make sure the chocolate is fully solidified and cooled off before I remove them from the mold. So set my 30-minute timer, and in the freezer it goes. And this is as good a time as any to clean out my syringe. Remove my screw from this so I can get the cap off. I didn't do that right. I should have pushed it out first. So the plunger goes back in. And I remove as much chocolate as I can get out that way. And scoop out the chocolate from the cap. Get the warm water running and get the chocolate out of the needle part here before it solidifies. Clean that plunger off. And clean the inside of the syringe. It's remarkably clean already. The O-rings on the plunger do a good job of keeping the inside pretty well clean. So cleanup was real easy with this, as I had hoped it would be. Less than a minute when I'm totally done with the job to completely clean out the syringe and all its parts. The plunger, I didn't even bother removing the O-ring from here, but you could pry it out and clean under it. I don't think there's enough of a worry there. It fits so tightly in there, I don't think anything got in there. But you could take it out and clean it. The masking tape can be left on or peeled off and put a new layer on the next time you use it. Since I'm done for the season, I'm just going to peel it off so I don't have any residue to deal with the next time I use it. Okay, the mold has come out of the freezer after a half hour and a couple minutes longer, and the easiest way I know of to get these out of here is to just invert the tray at a bit of an angle and tap it like that firmly, and most of the cherries will just fall right out. There's always a few stragglers. There we go. Third try is the charm. So there you have it. As can be seen in the close-up, these are well-formed cherry cordials. Hope there's a little gap that I didn't quite get, but that's all right. Otherwise, they're well-formed. Sometimes I have to trim just a little bit of chocolate off of these. Most of these are in real good shape, but occasionally I have to come by here and just use the knife to shave a little bit off the ones that had overflowed the mold. It's a cosmetic thing, but if you're going to go through the work of doing it, you might as well make it presentable. And you don't want to have these in your hands too long or you'll leave fingerprints on them. If I find that it's a little warmer in the room, I sometimes wear a nitrile glove or something to prevent any fingerprints from being left on the chocolate, because that discourages people from wanting to eat them. They just somehow look unclean when they see fingerprints on them, just like on a water glass or something. Of course, they know you've handled them, but seeing it somehow has a different effect. So those people who watched the other video about making the chocolate syringe might want to know how I thought ultimately the two gaskets worked out. I didn't put this in that video, so I'm tacking it on to the end of this video. The O-ring worked great. It was able to push down the column of chocolate without getting any backlash up the inside of the tube, so it had a pretty good seal. On the other hand, the masking tape wrapped around the pipe cap did just as good a job, and for a lot less trouble and expense. So yeah, I would recommend that if you're going to make something like that, just use the masking tape, unless you feel adventuresome and want to do the O-ring approach. The O-ring also has the downside that it's a little hard to get out of the groove once it's in there. You can pry it out with a small screwdriver or something, that's fine, but there's always the chance that something will get behind there, and it's sort of a growth medium. If it's kept dry, probably nothing would happen, and it's not a big deal, but if you're really obsessive about keeping these things absolutely spotlessly clean, you might find that the masking tape approach works best, because you can just peel that tape off and clean it really well before putting it away. So that's my upshot on which type of gasketing or O-ring material is the best. I should mention that Wilton also makes some other products which are alternatives to the syringe that I use, and I have used these before with some success. There's this funnel with a handle on it. It's made out of sort of a no-stick or low-stick plastic material, and it has a little valve in it with a trigger which goes in there, and by operating it like this, the ball seals off the end, or it lets the material in the funnel flow out. And I used this for a number of years making these cherry cordials, but I found that the chocolate was usually just a little too thick to flow out easily. I could have cut it with the melted shortening as Wilton suggests, but I hated to dilute the chocolate, and so I would actually kind of just shake it like that and entice it to come out, but it was a lot of work and I'd get frustrated. The syringe makes it so much easier because you can actually force it to go through. The hole's about the same size, but instead of just a gravity assist, I've got that plunger pushing it out. I have much better control. It's a lot neater, less mess. Another option is these candy making squeeze bottles. They're just like ketchup bottles, and you could probably use a ketchup bottle. Have to cut the nozzle fairly large to let the chocolate out, but you can fill that up. These actually work very well. The problem is that it's hard to clean them because you can't get in there very easily, and it's a pain to clean up. So I only use these one time. I would consider this viable, especially if you're cutting the chocolate. But if you have a few bucks and a couple of basic home tools, a saw, a drill, that type of thing, you could easily make a syringe like I did that works very well.